All right, thanks everybody. Name of this talk is Fragile by Design, large-scale evidence of supply chain risk. So we're going to talk about a number of assets we've analyzed and some of the findings from that analysis. So I'm the co-founder and CEO of NetRise. Prior to that, I was at Cylance, worked at DOE, I was in the Marine Corps once upon a time. If any of you have ever seen any of my talks before, what you'll know is that the most important thing I want you guys to leave with today is this picture of me and Chuck Norris in Iraq of 2007. A lot of people don't know this is actually the day we won the global war on terrorism. So yeah, I was a lot younger, cooler. Luckily now I'm better looking. So what we'll cover today, a data-backed view of the fragility of the software supply chain, why source code declaration. So basically we're going to talk about the distinction between looking at software supply chain risk from a compiled code perspective versus a source code perspective. So if you are whether you're a builder or a buyer of software, source code is only giving you one perspective, obviously. And in particular, if you're a buyer of software, whether or not the people building your software are using source code solutions doesn't really matter to you at the end of the day. All that matters to you is there risk in the software I'm buying or not? Like, you're not getting the source code, you're getting the compiled code, right? And then, how patterns and vulnerabilities, secrets, outdated libraries, how these things occur everywhere. I think a lot of people think that these are vertical-specific problems, asset-specific problems, and they're not. These are ubiquitous problems across all these different facets. I'm not sure what just happened. All right. So whenever you think of software supply chain security, there's a number of different ways that people have kind of verticalized this market, which is probably slightly frustrating. Gartner came out with their first software supply chain market guide this year, and in it were, I forget, maybe there was 12 vendors, but there was at least 6 vendors that represented 6 just totally different solutions. It'd be like having a firewall vendor and an EDR vendor and a spam filter vendor and just being like, yeah, this is a cybersecurity market guide, guys. We hope it's helpful. And this is, it's nice that they're at least putting stuff out because software supply chain security is finally getting the attention it seems to deserve. But nonetheless, you can just see how there's all these different ways in which to slice and dice this, whether you're talking about source code or provenance or application detection and response is a common acronym now, runtime security, infrastructure as code security, all these different elements. So when we talk about software supply chain security, when you're looking at the compiled code, you have a number of other artifacts in which you can analyze and determine the risk of. So you have, obviously, vulnerabilities, but you also have things like misconfigurations, cryptographic material, so public keys, private keys, certificates that don't really exist in source code for the most part. Credentials, binary protections, obviously, aren't going to exist until you've compiled the code. Sometimes they change, sometimes they don't. And then the full file system, depending on what it is. If it's like a router or some device, it will have a full file system just like a server would. But even in regular applications or installers, you'll find a lot of nesting and relationships between various dependencies, libraries, components, and the like. So we care about all of those things from an end-to-end perspective as it relates to software supply chain security. This is really just highlighting on, just traditionally people have viewed software supply chain security as selling a source code solution to a developer. And we're not saying that that isn't a part of software supply chain security. It clearly is. What we are saying is that's just one piece of it. And we've been doing that for over 30 years. And we can all see how successful that's been, right? This industry just insists that developers are going to turn into security people overnight. It hasn't happened. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think with AI development, it's going to become even less likely to happen. But we're still going to just keep saying it's going to happen for some reason. Even when we can prove that after the fact, all of these vulnerabilities, risks, and issues still exist, which we'll get to. So when we talk about fragility in the software supply chain, some of these things won't be a big surprise, but oftentimes software is just assembled more than it's written, right? Even enormous vendors and OEMs incur a significant amount of third-party risk. I mean, think about Rockwell Automation as an example, maybe, is buying a real-time operating system from Wind River, right? They don't own that code. Or people using open source components that are end of life or end of support. Or automotive manufacturers buying things from tier 1 suppliers like Bosch and Panasonic and Denso and companies like that. They have only so much control over those things. And so when there's an issue in something, upstream or downstream, that just introduces all these issues, which is one of the reasons that companies like Tesla and Apple made it such a big point to verticalize their own supply chain, so they would alleviate as many of these issues as they could. And it seems to me that both of those companies are doing okay. The inability to update a lot of these components is a problem. It goes back to the third-party issue I just identified. But even from an open source perspective, the number of times we find, components that are end of life for a very long time is significant. We did a recent research report where 60% of all brand new network appliances had an end-of-life Linux kernel the day it came out. So I think that's known as a worst practice. And so why is a particular component or artifact included? Does a particular component run? So is it ever even run? Is it ever called? If not, why is it there? Just the complicated nature of the assets in general. Like, what are the edge cases in which these things happen or don't happen? Jeez. From a manufacturer, so like a producer problem, how do you generate SBOMs? How do you do vulnerability management? What are the different remediation workflows? How do you guarantee or assess compliance adherence, CI/CD integration? Like, there's all these issues that most builders or software producers are not able to handle and deal with, at least in a comprehensive way. They might do some of these things, but they're definitely not doing all of them. And so a couple things that really kind of highlight this. The CPE problem, which I'm sure someone has given a talk about that or will, or it's been at least tangentially discussed, is such a crazy issue. Does anybody know? I mean, I guess I won't actually wait for an answer unless someone screams it out, but like, who can submit a CPE? Does anyone know? Anyone on planet Earth. Like, my grandma can just go submit a CPE right now if she wants. We've tested it. It's ridiculous. You just send an email to NIST and they create it. It's pretty wild. And even though it's that simple, the people building software don't do it. They wait until a CVE has been reported for something, and then they create a CPE for that thing. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, why does that matter, Tom? Well, the reason that matters is if something's brand new, and by brand new I mean has a new version, which doesn't mean it's brand new, just means it has a new version. That means there won't be a CPE created for it yet, which means there won't be any CVEs created for it yet. So imagine you go on a router from 17.1.1 to 17.1.2. Do you guys think that everything in the prior version just magically vanished? Obviously that didn't happen, but if you look up that thing in the NVD, it appears that way. And so this is one of the problems with not having CPEs for everything and kind of inheriting risk through the versioning process that we'll talk about. I mean, it's also just staggering how few companies even have product security teams at all. And so that overwhelmingly gets put on like the engineering and DevSecOps team, which, you know, those are two very distinct sets of skills and capabilities. All software risk is not determined by a CVE, as we'll talk about. So end-day vulnerabilities too will be another big piece. So in terms of buyers of software, how are you evaluating the risk of the things you are buying? Do you have an SBOM for the things that you're buying? Usually no. Can your vendor generate, one for you? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Do you have admin and root access to the devices that you're buying? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And are they in scope for red team engagements, which is another whole issue where some people will say you're a hospital. A lot of times they'll prohibit you from targeting medical devices and things like that for various quote unquote liability reasons, even though the real reason is because they know that their equipment is a total disaster. What I'm calling out here is you have this really big legacy device problem. So when I was at Department of Energy, and for anyone who was in the government or just in the industry at the time, like when Windows XP went end of life, that was like a much bigger deal at the time. Now, whenever things go end of life, it doesn't seem to be as big of a moment for whatever reason. But I remember just looking back on that now, especially, and thinking how big of a deal it was. And we ended up literally just throwing some vendors literally in a dumpster because they weren't able to get off of XP in time. That was fine. But now, everything has something end of life, and provably so. And yet, the reaction is just almost non-existent. And it's just like, why is that the case? And I think the answer is it's overwhelming for people. And I don't know what to tell people about that, quite frankly. It's not like our job to determine what's overwhelming and what's not to people. It's our job to just present reality. And then how people choose to react to that is up to them in some ways. But I think that this issue and paradigm is a real problem. The vendor potentially not even existing anymore is a really big issue in like Department of Defense, where source code just goes totally missing. How that happens is confusing to me. And then just analyzing some of these very difficult things to analyze, like real-time operating systems and the like. So a great example of this comes from a report that we released like last week, I think, where it's called a pixie dust attack on WPS. Craig gave a talk on this in the other room earlier. And this vulnerability was found in 2014. So for everyone who's not a math major, that was 11 years ago. And we had a pretty strong hypothesis that the vulnerability from 11 years ago was still present in the same family of models for the same vendors in which it was identified over a decade ago. And since we're doing all this component identification stuff and correlation between these different things, we said, let's see if we can prove that. So we got a bunch of the firmware, we downloaded it, we found the components, we wrote a CWE for this particular issue. It hit on those particular components. So we bought a bunch of the devices, we built the exploit, and sure enough, we were able to compromise and get this to work 11 years later. Now, the optimist in me, which is a very small very small part of my personality, would say, this must be the only scenario like this in all of technology, right? We somehow found that needle in a haystack. The cynic in me, which I also like to call a realist, is that this exists in literally every single device on planet Earth. And that's relatively provable, and you'll see some evidence of this later. But this is one just very small example of proving that old vulnerabilities don't always get patched. Even in the things in which they were originally disclosed for, let alone all the other things. And the reason for that is the people building the software don't have this level of visibility that we all expect them to have for all the different components across all the different models and all the different devices that they build and ship and everything else. It just does not exist. And that's, like, I think, very difficult for everyone to accept in some ways, but it's provably accurate. So yeah, you can see some of the highlights. So a question I ask people all the time is, imagine you have a brand new device. I don't know. Let's say it's a firewall from a top 3 company. You buy that firewall, you install it, you update all the firmware, you apply all the patches, you configure it. How many known CVEs, let's just ignore 0-day problems, how many known CVEs would you expect would be on that appliance? And I always caveat it by saying, pretend like you never met me. And the answer, there's really only one right answer. And that answer is 0, right? That is the expectation from the vast majority of people. Now, if some people have been doing this work, or, they've ripped apart these things on their own, they're going to probably have a different answer. But generally speaking, the answer is 0. And so, none, why are you not even asking, of course, maybe 3 or 4. And so what you're going to see here, this is a brand new firewall that's fully patched, fully up to date from a vendor everyone here has heard of. And so how can that possibly be true? Like, Tenable didn't tell me that was true, so it can't be true, right? And that's just because there's nothing wrong with what, like, Tenable or Rapid7 or Qualys or any of those other companies, they don't have this level of visibility. They're not getting into the file system of these devices and enumerating all of the components and libraries and dependencies and then correlating those with vulnerabilities and all these other things. They're just not doing it, right? So we're asking, from a risk perspective, from a risk identification perspective, we're asking a fish to climb a tree, right? And then we're upset when it doesn't do a good job. It's an unrealistic expectation for our existing set of tools and capabilities to give us this set of visibility. It just doesn't exist for the most part. I keep hitting this button. There's another, I guess, piece of pushback I get often, which is, well, I rely on my vendors to deal with this risk. I never understand these words when they're spoken to me. That's not how risk works. Like, if you eat food that has salmonella in it, like, the person who made the food doesn't get salmonella poisoning. Like, you do, right? It's the same thing. So if you buy a device that has risk and you put it in your network, the company you bought it for doesn't get compromised. You do. You see how that goes? So you can say you're relying on them to fix these problems and deal with these issues for you. It's just not true. It's never been true. But it's just a way for people to give themselves this, like, I don't know, peace of mind or something. Vendors, like OEMs, like, we have, I guess I can say we have liability. Everyone else has risk, right? which is a very big difference. So some of these key questions that I also kind of lead with is like, do I have log4j? If so, where? How many versions of OpenSSL do I have? Do I have any end-of-life, end-of-support software? Does any of my software have malicious contributors? At face value, these probably seem to be relatively basic, straightforward questions. But in practice, I've never met a single company that's able to answer these questions with any level of confidence or authority from a third-party perspective, especially, let alone first-party. And that is just that is a choice. That has become a choice in the industry. There just didn't used to be a way to do it. There's a bunch of people doing this kind of stuff now, thankfully. But the fact that we can't answer these questions anymore is not because it's impossible. It's because we're just choosing not to. And so this goes back to like this concept of non-CVE risk. And so if I have no CVEs, like let's just imagine all the components are perfectly up to date. There's no CWEs in anything. You know, God has come down and ran the DevSecOps team temporarily and built a perfect piece of software or whatever. There still exists all of these other artifacts that can introduce risk into your organization. So, you know, whether they're misconfigurations or like if we have a hard-coded set of credentials in a firmware image that has no CVEs on it, well, then we're just going to log into the device, right? Around 18 months ago or so, there was like a big issue with Cisco actually, where, you know, they were actually like pretty misrepresented, I thought, where there was a claim that some of their devices were being compromised, which was true, but it's because the people used terrible passwords. That was the issue. So they were just brute forcing the passwords. So it's like, okay, like we forget that these things like software and like are just like the servers in our environment and the workstations in our environment and the users in our environment. We have to secure them in the same manner. So in terms of like the scope and methodology for this like, you know, data set, we had like thousands of these things across containers, mobile apps, et cetera, a number of different analysis techniques, you know, all the different artifacts and assets identified and some of the risk over there. So speed it up here a bit. This is a different device that was released in 2025 that only has 9,649 CVEs on it. But I don't want anyone to worry. If you look it up in the NVD, it doesn't have any. So we might be hallucinating 9,649 times. But when you look on the right-hand side, you can see other things like expired certificates and hard-coded credentials that were also found. In this case, you can see, does anybody know the year that CVE came out? Correct. Well, as you can see here, the vulnerability we found here is from 1999. So I wish I could tell you how rare this is. It's not rare at all. It happens all the time, where we find components. And the bigger narrative here is not that there's a vulnerability from 1999. That's a problem. The bigger problem is that there is a piece of software in a brand new thing that is at least 26 years old, at least. And what that indicates is just a litany of other issues that obviously exist. If you're not updating something that's 26 years old and pushing it out to new customers and asking them to pay a premium for that thing, there's something going on here that is incredibly broken about the software supply chain. Here you can see 3 different versions of OpenSSL and 3 different versions of OpenSSH, you know, because why have one? You know what I mean? Why not have a couple? You know, have a really old one in there for like just like nostalgic purposes. And I will say this, I know I'm being a bit sarcastic, but there are some good reasons. You have some versions of OpenSSL that will support like FIPS level encryption. That's like a proprietary version, and then the other version does not, in case depending on how it gets configured. So there are some examples where that can be valid. Most of the time it's not, but there are some. In terms of how you prioritize these things, laying over additional information like exploitability, like are they available, are they being weaponized? I'm sure this is very familiar language to many people related to vuln check. Are these things exposed over the network? Things like that. So, because a lot of the times some of the other pushback we'll get is around, well, is it even reachable? Is this a problem are there even exploits available? And that's one of the great things that, the gentleman who was just up here speaking before me, talking about like on the initial access side, if there's not an exploit available, okay, like that like presupposes that one can't be written or something. Just because one doesn't exist doesn't mean one can't exist. So it's not like this is a perfect way to prioritize, but it's, it definitely helps in terms of just operating from a CVE or not. This is one of my favorite examples of supply chain fragility. It's a benign example, admittedly, I think, but we find typically 80 to 90% of all certificates on a brand new, whatever it is, are expired. And so whenever we ask people, hey, are you guys looking at these things before they go out the door? And of course, everybody says yes. Of course we are, Tom. Okay, great. So then why are there 1,000 certificates that expired a decade ago? And they just typically don't have an answer. But from prior data I've already showed where you have a component from 1999, it becomes pretty obvious that they're just not looking. But these are all the things that everyone in this room is downloading and installing and using, and that underpin everything that's going on around us. And no one is even looking. Because if you were, one of two things has to be true. Either you did look and you're just incompetent. I mean, because this isn't like we're not like, curing cancer here from finding expired certificates. Or you're just being disingenuous. There's just those are the only two answers, unfortunately. So that's always a good question. Credentials. We find this incredibly common, especially in firmware, where you'll find just a significant number of hard-coded credentials that are cracked. And I guess the analogy here would be, imagine if you bought a brand new Windows server operating system, and we found, in this case, 24 sets of hard-coded credentials in that file system that were like live credentials. Like the world would not be happy. But when this is the case for just like, all of our telecommunications equipment, something minor like that, people they almost can't relate to it in the same way because they don't view themselves as having the same level of access and management and administrative autonomy for these kinds of things, even though this is where all the attacks are basically coming from these days. Misconfigurations, same kind of thing. Binary protections. So I mentioned this, why you can just call out, okay, no stack canaries are being used, or at least in a significant amount of the code here. So why not? And that was just one device. Everything I just showed you, those last like 4 or 5 screenshots, was from one appliance. And this is not a single vendor problem. So I just picked on this like OpenSSH thing, and was able to correlate all the other vendors that had this problem. And you can see a lot of the names. I can't, maybe you can. But you see like Ruckus and Palo Alto and Zscaler, like massive organizations. And sometimes people get like, oh, you're calling out people, you're blah, 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 blah. You can't call out someone when everyone has the problem. When everyone has the issue, there's no such thing as calling out somebody. Like everyone has the problem. NetRise has this problem. Like everyone on planet Earth has this problem of having good visibility into their software supply chain and maintaining everything as best as they perfectly can. The reluctance to call it out is the problem. That's the issue. Wouldn't be a talk without a Boromir meme. And so just some high-level metrics. 88% of these assets contained 100 or more vulnerabilities. Over half of them had hard-coded credentials in them. A third had exposed private keys. So what I mean by that is we found both the public and private key for the same key pair in the same thing. So for those of you that are not cryptography experts, that's the equivalent of leaving your key in your front door of your house, essentially. 84% have vulnerabilities in components that are at least a decade old. And 3/4 or so had multiple versions of the same software or software component. This is just calling out that it's not a sector-specific problem. This is the kill chain from the Volt Typhoon attack that happened in Guam against a power plant. And everyone's like, yeah, but that was an industrial control. That was critical infrastructure, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it doesn't really matter what was behind it. They popped a Fortinet firewall. Like, that was the way they got in. What's behind the firewall is just totally arbitrary. It's totally arbitrary. Because after that happened, a bunch of other Fortinet firewalls in front of a bunch of other different industries got compromised also. So there's like this illusion that it's only critical infrastructure, it's only telco, it's only financial services, it's only hospitals, it's only water treatment facilities. It's none of that. It's everything. And so whenever you reach out to people and you ask them, what's our third-party risk posture look like, this is what you typically get. And this is what it actually is. For those of you who have gone through third-party risk things for procurement or whatever, next time you get a questionnaire back from someone, just really ask yourself, is this adequately representing the risk of the thing that I am buying? So in closing, if you ask 3 people to define software supply chain security, you'll probably get 7 different answers. The challenge goes way beyond vulnerability identification, component identification, all of that. There's a number of other things you can look at. And that this is a universal problem that binary analysis really helps uncover in a much more comprehensive way. Thank you, and I think I'm a minute over.